All right. Hey there, everybody. Sorry about the wait. Hopefully we're up and running now. So yeah, I guess let's get into it today. I'm not going to be actually live coding a project I'm currently working on, but looking at a viewer request, which today is how to do a D3 responsive graphic. So basically today I'll kind of walk you through my kind of philosophy and the kind of basic concepts behind how I approach this. There's lots of different ways to do it, but this is one way, and it's going to be a kind of contrived example, but hopefully it illustrates the main concepts. So I'm going to be using Blockup here to create our little demo application. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory, and let's call it June, and then just run Blockup to get a little Blockup instance going. All right. So let's go to the code. So obviously there's nothing here rendered yet. So we have to go ahead and create something. So basically I'll just do a kind of a simple bar chart graphic to illustrate the point of responsiveness. And let's see here, let's bring the code over. So if you haven't used Blockup before, it's a really simple scaffolding. It has an index page, which right now has nothing. And let's go switch this to D3 V5. And just it does some live reloading, and it uses stylus and all these sorts of great things. So just to show you that it's working, we'll start with some HTML. Yeah, okay, so let's just put in some kind of bare bones structure for the DOM elements. So if we're creating a graphic, I usually start with a container for the chart itself. So we'll just call that chart. And then we'll move this h1 tag inside of here and call it chart title in case we want to do something with that. Then we have we'll use SVG. You can use anything you want, but we'll just use SVG to create some rectangles. And let's also give that a class name, chart SVG. Okay, so nothing will look different here. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of styling just so we can see what we're working with. Also, I'm just going to zero out the margins on the body. And all right, so chart, let's just give it a max width because we're going to be doing responsive stuff, so we'll want to see what happens. And for starters, let's give it a background, maybe like some soft yellowish thing. All right, so we've got our chart. You can see the bounds of it. And then inside of chart, right, we've got title. And I guess we don't need to, we'll just put a background and everything so we can just kind of visually distinguish things. And maybe that's not, oh, it's double underscore. And then we also have the SVG. All right, so you can see our elements we got in play here. So I guess the first thing we need to do is make our graphic. So if we jump over to the script tag, oops. You'll see there's some presets here. This is just like a Blockup thing, but let's go ahead and actually delete all that. And the first thing I want to do is create some variables so we can access those DOM elements. So I use the $ here to indicate that I'm using a DOM element. I'm not actually using jQuery. So that's just like a personal preference thing. So just heads up. Also, I'm going to be writing an ES6 syntax. So you'll see stuff like const and a couple other things. You can just run this through like Babel if you're not familiar with ES6. So if you go to Babel.js, you can just go and run this code through here, and I'll translate it to normal looking JavaScript. But those are just a couple of heads ups. Okay, so we have the chart. We've got, let's get the SVG element, which is chart.select chart SVG. And let's see, we're going to be creating a bar chart. So I'm going to create a couple of kind of constants. So we're going to want like a height that's probably not going to change. So let's say bar height. Let's just pick a random number. 30 sounds good. And then some padding between the bars. And we'll just say it's bar height divided by 2. So first things first is we want to actually create a little bit of dummy data for our chart. So let's see here. Let's create a function called init, and we'll kick everything off inside of there. And let's just go ahead and create maybe like 5 bars, something simple. So we'll say data equals d3.range 5 map. We'll say call it index, and we're going to basically just be creating an array of let's see, an array of 5 elements. So index, we'll preserve that, and value, we'll just give them a random value between 0 and 1. Keep it simple. And just to show you what that actual output looks like, if you're not familiar with some of that syntax, it's just a glorified way of creating a simple array. So let's pop open the console here. And let me put on the bottom. Get rid of that stuff. And we have an error. We're missing a parenthesis. Okay. So you can see it just created a simple array with the values index and value, or the properties index and value. So next thing, let's go ahead and bind that to the DOM. So we'll simply say SVG, select all rectangles, pass that data to it, and then append rectangles. And so now we should see 5 rectangles in the DOM, nothing visual because we haven't set any of the properties yet. So if we look here, there we go. We've got our 5 rectangles. So then the next step, right, is usually, I guess, adding some visual representation to those. So we would then go ahead and say, so let's just save this down to a variable so it doesn't get a little too cluttered. We would say style x is 0, y, well, we'll go with 0 for now, and then width and height. And here we'd usually want to scale. We'll just, again, we'll put in just basic values so we can just start getting something on the screen. And then I'll walk you through my responsive process. And height, we do have that variable. So now when we save this, we should now see some rectangles all in the same spot in the top left corner. So we have to do a couple things here. First of all, we need to make this responsive. So I like to make everything responsive around the container. So basically choosing the outermost width as the width for my SVG. So we have to do a couple things here. So this is just the green square here is our SVG, and that's the default size of an SVG element. I think it's like 300 by 150. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add another element around these two so that we can capture the width, and you'll see why in a second. So let's go ahead and create a class called chart inner, and we're going to go ahead and put everything we want inside of there. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I probably want some padding, right, to give it a little breathing room. So let's go ahead and add some padding to the chart element. Just a nice solid 1 rem outside of it. And so this way, we want essentially, right, we want the chart to be, the SVG element to be the width of this thing right here. So the way we do that, right, is we can grab the width of that inner container because the chart element is not 100%. We want to set it in JavaScript. So we actually just want to go ahead and grab the width of chart inner and then set our SVG to be that. So first thing we'll do here is say, let's say const w equals, actually let's go ahead and create another variable, chart inner. And now we can say chart inner dot node dot offset width. And so that grabs the DOM element of chart inner and then grabs the width. We can log that out to see what we're working with. And you see it's 928. And now we want to use that and set the height, or sorry, the width of our SVG to that. So width W. And we don't care about the height just yet. We will eventually. So there we go. Now let's go ahead and create a scale. So const scale equals d3.scale linear. We're not going to mess with the domain because we want it to be between 0 and 1 still, but we do want to change the range to be from 0 to that width. So then we can use that scale to actually create the width of our bar, which will be scale of d.value, right? Because value is that random value between 0 and 1. And now we have a scale that will map it from 0 to width. So when we do that, we'll see that all the bars are still overlapping. So let's go ahead and set their Y position. So for this, we can simply do d, I, and let's say we have bar height plus padding. So basically we're just going to space them out based on their order. So I think that should end up looking nice. There we go. We notice we're cut off, so we actually probably need to calculate the height of the SVG as well. So we could do this a couple ways. So let's say we've got the width up here, so let's also calculate the height, which will be, we know how many bars we have, right? We have data.length, so we can just do the same thing here. We can just multiply data.length by the height and spacing of our bars to get the height of what the SVG element should be. And then we can go ahead and set the height of the SVG element as well. And there you go. So we've got our bars rendering. Let's also, let's sort them, because why not? It'll look slightly nicer. So we did the data. We can just simply throw a sort on here. D3, and we'll use the D3, let's use descending. And we're sorting it by value. All right. So now we've got our bars. The whole point of this video, though, was to illustrate how we handle responsiveness, because it's great that we created our chart. But now, if you notice this, you'll see we're obviously getting cut off, and this is not very responsive. So we need to make it responsive. So there's a couple things we can do. The first thing we're going to have to do here, and this is kind of the fundamental kind of concept behind this, which is divorcing or decoupling, I suppose, the rendering from the data joining. So we did all the data joining here in init, but we also did rendering, and we want to decouple those. So let's go ahead and create a render function. So this is pretty much something I always end up doing, and if you look at some reusable D3 libraries, this is kind of a common pattern. So let's see, all this stuff here that has to do with dimensionality and stuff, let's take that out. And I'm actually just going to drop it up here for now and comment it out. So the only thing we want to do up front here is work with data. So we get our data going and we bind it and we create the elements. But in terms of the actual visual output, we're going to save that for the render function. So let's go ahead and move that into the render function, which means we also don't need to store this variable. But here we actually will need to do a selection on the rectangles again. We could store it as variable, but this is fine. Okay, so inside of init, all we're doing is binding the data and creating DOM elements. And then the render function is going to handle the actual drawing. However, it needs to know about scale and all this stuff. So I'm actually going to comment this line out for now. Actually, I won't. We'll actually, sorry. Let's move this in here. So render will know about the scale, but obviously it needs to know W. So let's go ahead and right now just set W to this number here. So this actually works. And then we'll add in the next step. So now if we call render after we've set up everything, we should, let's see. We should see something work. It shouldn't totally break. Okay, so we haven't updated our SVG height. We're using a constant number, but we've divorced the two steps now, right? So we have the DOM elements created here, and we have it rendering here. So now we just need to add in the third and most important piece, which is the resize step. So once we've created our elements, we can actually go ahead and create a resize listener. So to do that, we simply say window.addEventListener resize and tell it to call this resize function, which we haven't created yet, when the window detects resize. So if we create that function up top, to prove that it's working, we'll just console log resize whenever the window resizes. And as you see me resizing the page, you'll see it firing a bunch of times. And it just keeps firing. And that's what you'd expect. So now what we're going to do is actually handle the dimension stuff in the resize function. So the stuff that we commented out, let's bring that back in. So on page resize, we want to grab the width of that chart inner thing, because since that's just a regular div and its width is 100%, its size is going to change automatically, right, as we resize the page. So we say chart inner.node offset width, and we grab that width. We're using a fixed height here, and actually we can't use data.length anymore because it doesn't have access to data. So what we should really do is, I guess, grab the rectangles. And actually, let's move. Yeah, let's move this. We'll come back to this part. So let's grab the width. We'll start with that. And then the other thing we want to do on resize is tell it to then render. And we'll actually go ahead and pass it W width, so it knows what to do with. It knows the dimensions to use for when it renders the new data. So render will expect this parameter W, which means let's get rid of it down here. And so it'll expect W, so we don't have to set it anymore, which will be coming from resize. And then the thing that we just moved over, we don't know data.length anymore, so all we have to do is grab the number of rectangles here. So let's go ahead and say, let's move this, our rectangle selector. So when render is called, we will grab the rectangles. And then for the height, instead of using data.length, we can simply say rect.size. So that'll just give us the number of rectangles we have, which is in essence the same thing. Then we need to update our SVG like we were doing before. I somehow deleted that. But again, that's the same thing. So we want to update SVG to be width W and height H. And now our scale is going to update every single time. So every time we call render, it's going to pass it a new range, and the scale will be updated. And now we can say, with all of our new rectangles, we can just go ahead and we'll rescale them. And now we have a responsive graphic. So let me go ahead and save this, and let's see what broke, because I just changed a lot. So it worked perfectly. But you'll notice there's no resize event called by default. So we actually need to go ahead and kick that off manually the first time, and then all subsequent times it'll be called automatically. So this is just creating the listener. And then this is saying, okay, go ahead and resize the page, like basically force it to resize, which we'll grab the width, call render, and do everything that we needed to do. Perfect. So now when we save this, when we resize, and maybe I'll do it slower, you'll see that every time we move it, the bars resize, and now we have a responsive graphic. So that's really all there is to it. The basic principle is do data binding as its own step, and I did it on a init. You could, if you have a stepper, it could be a function where it's calling data updates, but the main principle is separate your data binding from your rendering, and that makes it really easy to just update, whether it's on resize or something else, to update the dimensions of the graphic. There's a few things we can do though, to optimize this. So if this is a really simple chart, and actually let me go ahead and log out. Let's just log out W here again every time the page resizes. Okay, so as I resize, you'll see it console logs tons of events here, and it's actually a lot less than it usually is because my computer is using video streaming, so it's kind of janky right now. But usually this will spit out like tons of stuff, and that's great because it means it's being very responsive. But let's say you have a really complex graphic with tons of DOM elements. It's really bad on performance if you're going to be like redrawing everything on every single resize. So you actually want to use a debounce function here. And basically what debouncing means is it will not call that function within a certain period of time. So if this, let's pretend resize got called like 100 times in the second, you could say, okay, debounce it so it only calls at most once in a second. So it's kind of, it's really useful because when you have a complex graphic, you don't want to just be redrawing it when the user is resizing, because most likely if they're resizing the page, they're resizing it to like a smaller screen and they don't care about the intermediate steps. So usually I'll like let them finish the resize and then redraw the graphic, and that's where the debounce comes in. So you can just Google debounce function. I think they're really small, and you could just grab one from this site, which I've been to before. I'll show you how to do it. There's a few libraries. I'll use one called debounce, which I use all the time, which is based on, I think, either Lodash or something else. Anyways, so once we've installed that, let's go ahead and include it in our script. So this is, again, the ES6 way of including modules, but you could just do it as a normal script tag or whatever. Okay, so we've got debounce. So all you have to do, which is really simple, is instead of saying resize, instead of passing the function right here, we actually call the debounce function and say resize and how much of a delay we want. I usually do something like 150 or 200 milliseconds. So basically this means it'll wait 200 milliseconds before calling the resize function again if it's already been called. And so that's all you have to do. And now when we save this and run it, we'll actually see, even though it's resizing a bunch, it's spitting out way fewer of those resize events. And so like it could be a little more dramatic if we do like 1,000. That's 1 second. There you go. So I think I find a nice value is like 150, 200 milliseconds, and that just kind of throttles this redrawing, so it's a little more performant. So if someone's going back and forth or resizing the browser, it doesn't like crash potentially if you have a complicated visual layout. So yeah, that's about it. I can put this block up on the internet so you guys can check out the code. Otherwise, definitely ping me if you have any questions. And if you have any things that you want to see broken down in code, we'll definitely be doing more stuff like this. So just hit us up on Twitter or whatever with requests, and maybe we'll do one. All right. Thanks, everybody.